Ready to move to the next level in your product career? I'm Shobhit from Intentional Product Manager. Join me as we discuss ways to help you stand out in your job search and your career so you can have more impact and make more money. Everyone, welcome to the Intentional Product Manager podcast. So with me today is Lauren Mytton, Group Product Manager at Google Play, and my former colleague from Google. So Lauren is an inclusive and empathetic product leader with a drive for product excellence alongside human connection. She's worked in multiple industries: finance, telco, tech, many roles: strategic, operational, analytical, technical. And really, it's given her the ability to ramp up quickly in new domains, to get things done in different environments, to bring a lot of creativity and fresh perspectives in the process. Lauren, welcome to today's podcast. A lot of the focus of today's podcast would be about some your career and then some all about Google Group Product Manager roles and Google in general, because people are very curious about Google as a company. Let's first get to know a bit about yourself. Could you give me like a bird's eye view of your career journey?
Yes, I think it's another one of those career journeys that probably makes a lot more sense looking back than it did looking forward. I'll sort of describe it looking forward and then try and connect the dots. So I was one of those people who always knew what I wanted to do growing up. From sort of about the age of 11 or 12, I wanted to study theoretical physics and I wanted to win a Nobel Prize, kind of like small ambitions like that. And I therefore went to university and studied maths and physics. And it was only then that I started to think, hang on a second, maybe I need to kind of rethink these dreams. So I did a couple of summer internships and work experiences in different labs where I spent time working alongside professors who were studying the stars or the Earth's magnetic fields and how it changed. And I was also in my university studies surrounded by some amazing people. And I began to sort of think to myself, and I wouldn't necessarily say looking back that I was right to think all these things, but one of my thoughts was, maybe I'm not good enough to do what I want to do. And I think in hindsight, that probably wasn't true. But another thought that I did have was, it's not enough just to love the subject matter that you're working on. You also got to go in to wherever you work every day and enjoy the environment. And at that time, and I'm sure things have changed, I didn't really feel like I fitted in the environments where I was doing this lab experience. And so I had a slight crisis of, well, maybe I don't want to spend the rest of my days in academia, but what on earth do I do if I don't do this? Because I hadn't thought about anything else. I'd sort of, stopped thinking about it decades before, having already assumed I knew exactly where I was going. And so I kind of fell into a role in banking when I left university. So if you're a maths graduate and you don't know what to do with yourself and you have a choice sort of to take different roles, there's some very well-paid jobs out there in finance. So that's what I did. But I always felt at the time that I had slightly sold myself out. It wasn't an intent, like I'd spent such a long time coasting the sort of tailwinds of a decision I had really thought a lot about. And then I just, almost, at a moment's notice, flipped to something different. And the other thing that was also very clear to me as I worked in my banking role, so I was on the trading floor in a front office role with somewhat complex financial products. I was doing risk arbitrage, sales trading, and that generally means you're buying and selling stocks and or FX in different ratios to capitalize on a spread between two things in order to make a profit. And the best part of my job was when I got one day asked to fix a spreadsheet that had live feeds in it for my team. And that rapidly turned into me building an entire trading tool that did end-to-end sort of reconciliations, helped identify when it was the right time to trade, to maintain those spreads, and enabled traders to sort of do multiple trades and then do the sort of average of all those trades and confirm it. All this manual stuff I had been doing, I suddenly got to get the computer to do for me instead. And I realized there was something very wrong, that the job that I was paid to do and that's supposedly the most prestigious job in banking was one I really didn't enjoy. And all the supposedly sort of back end work of having the the systems that drive that capability was the thing I loved spending my time on. I didn't know at the time that, there was any product manager role out there. I just was like, I like building stuff. I don't really like doing transactional work. So I left banking and jumped into, a few different jobs along the way, but I worked at Three, which was a telco in the UK. For those who know it, it's part of a much bigger conglomerate called Hutchison Whampoa. They bought the first 3G mobile license in the UK. I was there at the outset. So it was essentially a very well-funded startup. And I there was in more of an analytical role, but thinking about product features long-term. What data do we need to be able to deliver these really powerful real-time mobile experiences on phones? And by the way, what is funny these days is I look back then and think that Google and Apple are only now building the sorts of experiences that Three was trying to do all those years ago. That's how far behind they were in terms of timings. And what I ended up doing there was actually having been asked to do a lot of data work, thinking, I don't really trust this data. We've launched with spreadsheets and provisioning and all kinds of manual processes. And then I ended up getting into a whole load of other internal tools support and recognizing that our billing system wasn't properly connected to our network. So customers were not necessarily being billed for the tariffs that they were on, or the data that we had on them in our CRM system wasn't aligned with the actual billing system, which meant that a lot of service requests would fail. So I again, it was a very process improvement type role that I ended up falling into there. I also worked at Amazon, which again was operational, quite analytical, really helping them to manage buying inventory and in stocks for the European media business. And again, there in fact was another taster of the PM role, where I spent a lot of time ranting to the internal tools teams about how their tools didn't allow us buyers to operate effectively. They were building functionality in silos, whereas we had to sort of deliver an end objective. And I wanted us to be able to engage with them against these objectives rather than against individual tools, and work out what the process was to get there. And again, looking back at this, I was defining CUJs without ever knowing what a CUJ was, but again, internal users. And then going to Google, so you're kind of seeing the themes now. I joined Google in a sales ops role. Again, a lot of analytics processes, but ended up thinking, hang on, these sales teams don't have reporting. They need reporting for their role, and ended up working on a reporting tool with internal engineers for sales teams, worked very closely when we developed the second V2 CRM tool the sales team used, worked very closely with product managers at Google there, and began to think I want their job. So around this time, I finally understood what a PM role did. And I think at that stage, I think I was sort of married by then. And I, for those of you on this call who sort of have families or are thinking about families, it's kind of often, I think, interesting to understand how your family life fits into your career. Your career doesn't happen in an absolute vacuum. So I remember thinking I really want to become a PM, and I was trying to work out how could I do it. And at the time at Google, you had to find a rotation and sort of pick up the skills, and then you'd have to do a load of interviews. And as I said, I didn't come from a purely tech background. I came from the sort of maths analytical background, and I really wanted to do a PM role. I also found out I was pregnant, and so the clock was sort of ticking. And what ended up happening was did a lot of networking, couldn't land myself a PM role, but found a role in Google Play in business operations. So moving out of the Google Ads business into the Google Play business, which I connected with a lot more because I'd sort of come from more of a B2C background with the products I'd worked on. And also I think you have to be able to understand your users to do a great job in your role. And having never been in marketing, even though I learned a lot about ads, it was never sort of second nature to me as I think other domains were. So I moved to Google Play in the business operations side of things. So sort of strategy, operations, analytics, driving projects to improve the business. So, and had a few months there before I went on mat leave, and then came back to that role after mat leave and settled in for a while. Still always had a hankering for PM, but I had this sort of stable, exciting role for a while. And then having been established there for a while, my then managers at some point, I think I must have said to them, look, I'm thinking about the next step. And this was also at a time where our team's future was a little uncertain. So it was sort of timed it well. I said, look, I really want to explore this again. And I got sort of verbal approval from them to explore a PM role, possibly as a full-time rotation. But the caveat was I was pregnant again at this point. And so what they said was, look, you can't do it now because you've got to set the team up for success. You can put your finger in the role and see what it's like. So I did a 20% rotation whilst in my last 6 months of being pregnant before I left, whilst also trying to wrap my team up after I went. So as you can imagine, it was a pretty full-on time. But for me, it was really important that when I went on maternity leave, I had some idea of where my career was going when I came back. I didn't feel like I wanted to just go off with a complete question mark in front. So I really wanted to feel when I came back, I better understood if this was the right role for me. So I did the PM 20% project to basically satisfy myself this is definitely the move I want to make. And I also knew that if I made a move across, assuming I got through all the interviews, I was almost certainly going to be down leveled. My career momentum would, slow for a while. And I was pretty well established in this previous role. So I just wanted to be certain it was the right thing to do. So second maternity leave, came back expecting to go into a role as a PM. I was told, sorry, can't do that anymore because the entire team got reorged in the meantime. And anyone who's worked at Google knows that reorgs happen pretty regularly. So when I came back, I was told you have a different role. You need to do this role and establish yourself in it because we need you there. And then afterwards, once you've done that, then, we'll consider it. And I sort of asked, so what does that mean? What does established mean? How will I know when I've got there? And there wasn't a really good answer to that. But what I got really lucky was, and again, so much of career is luck. My old manager at Amazon happened to have, through a circuitous route of his own, founded a company after leaving Amazon, got acquired by Google, brought into Google in Zurich, and then had just made a move back to Google London. I was now director of the team that I was hoping to get into. And he said to me, look, we don't have headcount for you right now. No, in fact, no, sorry, he said the opposite. He said, look, I've got headcount. I know you're not a PM yet, but if you want to take a role in my team on your old job ladder, then we'll figure it out. So he basically pulled me out from having to go back into this other role that I wasn't hugely keen on, but clearly would have happily embraced in preference to having no role at all, and brought me in as a PM to his team. And that's the team where I am still today. But I had to still go through the transfer process. And I did get down leveled, and there are a lot of times I had to think to myself, how do I know this is the right thing? And I can sort of talk through how you make decisions like that. But yeah, that is the circuitous route that got me to where I am now.
Lauren, if I'm not mistaken, you've been in PM roles and progressing for 5 years or so?
I think it's 4 or 5 years now, yes.
That's pretty awesome. Let's talk more, because you just mentioned an important thing. So now, you have this decision to make that, hey, cool, I could take this new role, but I'm going to be down leveled. And, it's like anybody doesn't like to be down leveled in the switching ladders, but that's actually a reality of most switches into PMs. How did you think through that decision?
I think, first of all, I had this really interesting conversation with the coach early on in this process, where he sort of asked what were my career highlights and lowlights. And it was very clear as I did this that all my highlights related to the products I built. Every time I've left somewhere, I've left behind something that was still going after I went. It wasn't, as I said, not transactions, things that sort of are out of date as soon as you've done them. It's structures. And so the first thing was, I knew in my core, this is what I really love doing. But that doesn't necessarily give you enough to get through the sacrifices. So I think the other things that came to the fore were, I often try and sort of propel myself into the future and think, when I'm on my deathbed looking back, will I think I was so glad I was an LX at Google? Or will I think about what I did with my time as an LX at Google already anywhere else? And then the third thing, I was surprised by this when I became a parent, because you hear people, and I don't always like this sort of narrative that, especially for women, once you become a mother, nothing else matters so much. And honestly, I had no idea how I would feel after becoming a mother. I was curious if that would be the case. I didn't necessarily think it would be. I've always been very invested in my work, and it's a big part of my identity. And what I actually found was that as a working mother, when you go to work, you leave your children behind to go and do something. And so it's actually even more important now than it was before, that thing is worth leaving them behind for, that I feel like it's a good use of my time. And not only that, but as a role model to my children, I want it to be something that I feel proud to tell them about. So I very much wrestle, and I still do wrestle sometimes when I look at other people who were peers or even junior to me at the time that I made this change, and I see where they are now. But I have to remind myself, I get up every day and I do X. How do I get myself out of bed in the morning? Like, I have to have a reason to. How do I feel good about what I do for myself? And as I said, for my children, the people who look up to me. So it's not easy, you're always going to have these reminders, but I do feel like I know why I've made that decision, and I just have to remind myself occasionally why I made this decision. So that's how I thought about it.
A lot of people will not consider this as, okay, now I'm a mother, so the time at work is time away from kids, so it has to be worth it. I think that was very insightful. And then the role model aspect also felt like something very insightful, something I also always feel like that. Hey, would my children be proud of me having done something this way? So now I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about, cool, now you're a group product manager at Google, and this confuses people. They're like, I don't, because, titles are different, ladders are different. What does a group product manager do at Google? What's your team like? Let's dive in more into that.
I think PMing at Google is very different in different parts of Google. And even within Google Play, which is where I work, I've sort of seen different structures in, say, the US versus the UK. So I don't know that you should generalize hugely from what I say, but I'll certainly give you my perspective. I see a group PM role as being a role that manages a group of PMs, other than being an individual contributor, although you may still also contribute directly. But it's a role where you own a domain, and you own a domain that is large enough to need multiple PMs. I mean, it's possible as an individual PM that you will own a single domain, but I think it's got to be a level that is broad enough to need more than one person. And I think a lot of being a group PM role is about influencing up, actually. You're representing your domain to others as much as you are, and I mean others outside your direct reporting org. So I work in the Play developer team, which is part of Google Play. But a lot of my role as a group PM is actually engaging with my stakeholders in the games and the apps teams and other organizations. So that is a big difference, I think, between the group PM and the individual role. Our team is called Store Presence. It's responsible for all aspects of developers' marketing, presence, and growth on Google Play, except for monetization, which is sort of handled by a different team, but there is an overlap. So I think I own a domain, which is actually lots of smaller subdomains, and I need a narrative around all of that. People can build narratives at the IC level, but I need a narrative for how my whole domain connects together at the top level, and to be able to explain to other people why my team exists. I also manage other PMs. That's sort of a practical note. So some of the other differences that come out of being a group PM versus an individual PM is I'm now prioritizing other people's work and not just my own. I'm looking across within PMs and across and thinking about where they're spending their time. And I'm thinking about org structure beyond the PM lens. To be clear, I think you could be doing some or all of these as an individual PM, and actually to get to the group PM, people probably need to believe that you can do these things if you haven't already demonstrated them. But they are much more day-to-day part of the role as a group PM, whereas they would be more opportunistic, I think, at the IC level. So in terms of org structure and health, I'm thinking about the PMs that are in my team, the engineering structure that supports them, the different capabilities that we have in that team, the velocity at which we're delivering, UX design support, product analytics. I'm thinking about the entire end-to-end structure and health. And as I said, as an individual PM, you're leaning on all these people to get things done as well. So you should also be doing that, but you may have less ability to influence it as an IC. Whereas I think at the level of the group PM, you have a little bit more ability to say and organize people to work in a certain way. You don't sweat all the implementation details as a group PM that you might do as an IC. You have to sort of have a nose for which of the things are going to potentially go really badly wrong if I don't dig under the covers, and which are things that I might do differently, but which I just have to accept not going to add any value if I intervene. A, I don't have the time, and B, it might sort of disempower others. So sort of trying to make the call between where is a really good use of my intervention and which is just sort of a bit of vanity or ego, perhaps, rather than actual true value add.
Somebody used a term, they say, sometimes you got to let small fires burn. PMs don't like that. We're problem solvers. We want to solve everything.
Yeah, and I think actually I like finding small fires that I can let burn because there are often a few that I can't. So it's always a relief. It's actually often just a relief to say, oh, that's a problem, but that's pretty contained. I'll see what happens. I guess the other two things I will mention are I do write many fewer PRDs than I used to, but not zero. And I still get to influence how people talk about the products through the narrative. And when they're bringing product pictures to review, I still get to sort of help them figure out how to talk about it. So I don't feel that I've lost as much influence as I thought I might when I stopped writing PRDs. And I think the other thing is, and I'm not sure I'm brilliant at this yet, but I think upleveling my communication, recognizing how much more impact it can have, how the smallest things I say could be amplified and interpreted differently or from what I'd intended. That is a big sort of something that's really I'm aware of now. I think my locus of influence, rightly or wrongly, felt smaller, and I was a bit more cavalier in the things I said. And now, although I still like to have fun and be informal, I also realize that I have to actually be quite careful sometimes to make sure I'm setting the right tone and curating what I say so that people aren't sort of, unnecessarily worried about things or whatever the potential risks are of any communication in the office.
You mentioned one thing that sometimes people underestimate, so I want to just dig into that. It's like having a cohesive narrative at your level without you defining like the specs of the individual products. Like, how does that work and manifest in your current role?
If you get the narrative right, you use it again and again, and everybody will use it in everything that they do. So we were always launching new features. I've just come back from Playtime in Google EMEA Playtime in Milan, where we did sort of announcements to a number of developers, new features, and explaining to a developer what you've launched, getting the words right is actually takes a lot of time. But if you've got your overall narrative for your domain right initially, it all follows from that. If you don't have an overarching narrative for why you exist and what you're here to do, you're starting from scratch with every new feature you build. And actually, that means your users, in this case developers, will never be able to piece it together because you're giving them 25 ingredients and never explaining what it is that they can make with them. So actually, I feel like the narrative is a very creative, sort of non-linear part of doing the role. It's the kind of like, literally in my head, I'm throwing in all the pieces that we do, the sort of store listings, promotions, audience targeting, reporting, all the different aspects of what we do, and thinking, what is it we're trying to achieve with this? And actually the process of crafting the narrative is also what helps you recognize the gaps in your product offering. It's the same way that Amazon has often worked, right? You start with the headline and then work back. That's kind of what I'm doing when I think about the narrative for my team. And I'm talking about developers, but actually the reality is that certainly in Google, the first people you've got to convince are all the people who are funding your team and then having you to go and do this work. So I've got to get the narrative to be compelling and simple for people who are a long way removed from these tools. And so actually that is part of not just launching the products well, but even being given the license to go and build those products in the first place.
You've had multiple stints as a group product manager across Play. Have these differed in various ways, like work environment or your role or other aspects?
Yes. My first role as a group PM was on the quality team in the Play developer org. So I was focused there on helping app and game developers to improve all aspects of quality. And so the domain was highly technical, and a lot of the dependencies for product work were deeper in the tech stack, working at the level of the Android operating system, for example. Whereas what I do now, which is developer growth tools, is much higher up in the stack in terms of its business impact and business tools, and essentially helping developers manage their presence on and beyond Google Play. So the domain in itself and my ability to get things done had a very different set of considerations when I was in the technical side of things. Also, the sort of relationship I had, I think, with engineers was very different. I think it was quite a good grounding as a new PM to be thrown into a domain where it was very hard to see how to add value. I didn't feel like it at the time. I sort of thought my managers had possibly made a big mistake by putting a new PM without a sort of computer science background on a team that had to, help developers debug ANRs, for example. And with hindsight, it really helped me sort of build. I think a lot of PMs who come from a SWE background are often told, look, the software engineers have their role and you have yours, and it's not helpful for anybody if you encroach in their territory. I mean, I was in a world where there was no way I was going to add technical solution value for the most part. So it really helped me to find my niche upstream from that and understand what the product needs were, and actually building a narrative was one of the single biggest things that we did. And I remember one of the engineers I worked with, after I wrote an annual plan, and I'd only been in the role about 3 or 4 months, he said, finally, I understand why we're doing what we're doing. And my jaw dropped, because I was like, how is it that you have been working and building all these tools for so long, but not really known why? So that was very kind of an interesting place to be.
Always great to hear that when your engineers are like, cool, I get the mission now, I'm out for it. Let's talk a bit more about, like, when you compare this to the senior product manager role at Google, which is IC. What are the differences in what you do and maybe your capabilities that you need?
I think there's a lot more upward communication and influencing, understanding how to talk to senior people, not just in your org, but in others. I think that's one of the biggest differences, knowing how to pitch what you say, understanding how to filtering to the level of complexity and interest that is useful for other people. That is something that I think is like a never ending, skill. You can always get better at it. And I think I was much less equipped to do that. I think it's also a bit chicken and egg. As you get less exposure to senior people when you're more junior, it's also hard to understand what it is that they need. So there's a sort of a reinforcing cycle here as you build that exposure. It becomes easy if you use your observational skills. Of course, you might not, in which case you won't learn. But assuming that you do, it becomes easier to see very quickly what is helpful and what totally derails any discussion or meeting. I think maybe less is different though than you might imagine. I think one thing I was writing as I was preparing, I was thinking, key part of my role is to make sure that everybody across the team understands why we're doing the things we're doing, has the ability to raise concerns, that I get to hear what may be sort of holding us back without expecting people to come forward. But when I think about that, that's what any good ICPM should be doing as well. You need to be creating an environment where everybody knows why you're building the product that you're building and is able to air concerns and challenge. And that's what a healthy team should be doing. So, in a way, I just think I'm doing the same as before, but on a bigger scale and on more topics. And I suppose the other thing that is very much different is the sort of understanding org shape and health. That's something that's totally new, not just a shade more involvement. I'm now thinking, how do we organize an engineering team to minimize shared ownership, but how do we staff 2 areas with unknown resources in a way that we can flex between them as we need to? Those are the sorts of things I didn't have to think about at the lowest sort of unit of the org.
Tell us more about how is it to work there? Yeah, just give us your view of Google right now.
So we'll say, and I think you'll hear this from anybody who's been at Google a while. I've been at Google over 10 years across these different roles. A lot has changed. It isn't the company that it was when I joined in terms of the real sort of highly flexible, mobile company. I think one thing I sort of talk to people about internally when they're sort of saying, are we now a big company? I think the challenge for anybody is that you can't forget where you came from. So you've always got a benchmark of the past. But the reality is that benchmark is not helpful if you're assessing where you are now, because you can't go back. The only comparisons that are ever really useful are to look at where else you could be right now. And so what I will say, and what I do say to people a lot of the time, is if you are frustrated about X or Y, I'll sort of haven't answered your question directly now, go and look at other places. Can you do better? If you can, that's amazing. Go for it. If you can't, that tells you that whatever comparisons you may be mourning, you have to come to terms with those. And I'm not saying that that's easy, but actually a lot of the time, people looking outside come back with renewed faith and appreciation for what they have, because it could be very different. So I guess having said that, I'm kind of circling around it. The reality is, and I think it's probably clear, since sort of Google became Alphabet, since we got Ruth and now the new CFO Anat, it's been a huge amount of focus on delivering shareholder value back in the near term. That never used to be the case. It's driven a lot of the restructures, it's driven a lot of the layoffs. The competition is also increasing. The world economy has changed. Gen AI is bringing a whole lot of new capital expenditure. So many things have changed. And so the reality is that there's a lot more scrutiny on where resources are going. There's a lot more top down, this is what we need, versus have a play in this area and see what you find. There's a lot less mobility internally, especially right now, I think. So there is a lot of, there isn't a lot of growth, I would say, for people who want to move rapidly in the way that they used to be. And it's probably almost certain that if you go to a different, smaller company, you could grow in some definition of that word a lot more quickly. If you measure growth by literally levels in a business, how quickly you move up, it'll happen a lot more quickly. You may also, if you measure it in terms of like the amount of scope and responsibility and impact you have, that may or may not be the case because it depends on the company and what they build, right? So it's not like when you went to school and every year you went up a level, right? No one expects that when they start a job, but there is some level of expectation of movement nevertheless. And I think, as I said at Google, that's hugely slowed. But you have to look at what the alternatives would be. And I think for me, some of the most inspiring things are, first of all, again, like some amazing people that I work with. The team I used to work with, the quality team, one of the best teams I felt I've ever had the privilege to work with. And the team I'm on now is much bigger because I've gone up a level. So I can't say I know everybody as closely as I did, but the people I work day to day with, my leads, again, it's a real joy to build things together with great people and to learn from everybody. So that is the case. There are some amazing benefits still at Google. The education support you get, the ability to travel and talk to developers in my role, the knowledge that you're actually having a big impact on a lot of people in a meaningful way. These are all, huge wins. And you're also adjacent to so many other amazing things that are happening. So Notebook LM, which is going viral right now, it's incredible that I'm on the internal chat group and I'm seeing the team talking about the products, giving feedback, getting under the covers a bit. It's so fun to be part of that. And you do get to be part of that at Google, no matter where you are in the business. So yeah, I think a lot depends on where you're coming from. Obviously, for a lot of people, I would say Google is probably going to be one of the best places you could ever work. It certainly was for me. I never expected to stay anywhere as long as I stayed at Google. At the same time, as I said, long-standing Googlers will be quite, I guess, sentimental and mournful about some of what's changed. You say, have I got any advice for other product management job seekers? I feel very embarrassed to say it's hard to give advice if you haven't left your company. You've only done internal transfers for the best part of a decade. But yes, I think it's not easy to find something else out there that's as inspiring, where you kind of believe in the products as much. So I still think it's a very amazing place to work.
Just want to thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing your insights, the experience of your career, your thoughts on different types of roles, and Google, of course. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Shobhit. Thank you very much for thinking of me and asking me to speak.
Hey, be sure to check out our website at intentionalproductmanager.com to see how you can level up in your career.